The next pattern in the making method call simpler series is called introduce parameter object. The motivation here is that you have a group of parameters that naturally go together, so replace them with an object. This is in fact very similar to the pattern preserve whole object, although in this case we're not preserving an existing one, but rather creating a new one. So let's take a look at these objects we have. We have this account, which has a list of entries. An entry is a value and a date on which it was charged. So this is probably a bank account of some kind. We don't really need the entry anymore. We're looking at the account here. We want to be able to get the flow between the start and the end. So what was the positive or negative result of all the charges between these two times? Now, this is a very common example. We see these ranges a lot passed through different methods in all kinds of systems, whether it's a date or time, maybe it's an integer, start or an end, or a low or a high bound of some kind. But essentially, these two things go together. And so we should really create an object that holds these two things. So let's do that. Let's just call it date range. Simple enough. Now we'll use add parameter on this. We'll just call it range. Then of course we'd have to update any calling code to include a parameter. That hasn't really changed anything yet, but now we can change it here. Let's go one parameter at a time instead of both. So let's, instead of calling start, we'll call range.start. And then we can use remove parameter on this, update any calling code, rerun all of our tests. Then we'll do the same thing with this end parameter. Call range.end, use remove parameter on this, update any calling code. And just as with preserve whole object, what this is essentially showing us, much more obviously at this point, is that we have a calculation here that can really go on the range itself. So let's do that. We'll call it includes again. And we just need to know if start is less than or equal to the given date and end is greater than or equal to the given date. So then here we can say if range includes the charge date on the entry. So just as with preserve whole object, in this pattern once again we've moved the actual mathematical calculation to the object that's holding the values. It doesn't really care about the business logic behind that calculation. It just knows that between these two values we can calculate something. And then the business logic here is whether or not the range includes a given date from the entries on the account. And so the calculation is in one place, the actual business logic is in another. Both are where they belong. And now this pattern, and it's pretty obvious when we use things like a date range or a numeric range or something like that, but this is actually really useful in a lot of other situations as well. For example, let's say you have a constructor or a factory method that takes a ton of parameters which describe an object. Well, maybe we could create a simple little object or even just a struct or any kind of data structure that holds all of those parameters. Maybe even does some internal logic on whether or not those parameters are valid. For example, in order to create a widget object, you might need to pass it 5 or 10 primitive values. Well, instead of that, we could have this widget creator object or a widget description object, which holds those values, and then you would just pass that one object into the constructor instead of all of those different primitives. And instead of having the constructor determine whether or not you've passed it valid entries for a widget, the object that describes it can determine whether or not those entries are valid before you even talk to the widget constructor. Again, it's a common pattern that you can find in a lot of places, not just with these primitive ranges here, but really anywhere that you're passing multiple values that essentially go together. You can introduce objects for all sorts of purposes just to hold those values in a single place. That's it for the introduce parameter object pattern. Thanks for watching.